There's no denying that a good title is very important if a filmmaker wants their movie to stand out from all the other movies and stories out there. There have even been some reported instances of a movie becoming a huge success based solely off the title alone. But that being said, coming up with a good name for a story can be a lot trickier than some might think. I even remember thinking from my days of writing books that the hardest part of writing was coming up with a good title. But that's only partially true, as some titles actually came very naturally to me, while others were nearly impossible to figure out. In the end, for me at least, it was all dependent on what the book was about. But the point is, the title of a movie can be more important than people realize, and as I just touched on, can directly affect just how good or bad a movie does with audiences. And today, I'd like to go over several movies that prove this to be true. And minor spoilers may abound for some of the movies in question, so in case you don't want something ruined, you might just want to be on the lookout. Okay, so before I actually get into the subject of this video, let me pull up a quick statistic first. Many experts say that first impressions are very important and extremely long-lasting in how a person judges somebody else. Even if it turns out that first impression is the complete opposite of how the person really is, those first few moments of judgment can subtly affect how that one person views another for possibly years afterwards. Now you might be wondering, what's my point with this? That a movie's title is generally the first thing any given person is going to know about that movie, and thus will have perhaps the greatest effect on what they'll think of it before they see it, especially if they don't have access to a description or trailer for the movie in question. So as a result, the movie's title is very important to getting people interested in a story in the first place. And of course, many a person has employed vastly different methods to find an appropriate name for their stories that will also get their potential audience hooked, which has, rather famously, led to some rather bizarre titles that honestly have nothing to do with their given story. Like, for example, To Kill a Mockingbird is not about hunting. It's a court drama tackling racial prejudices. Or Inherit the Wind, which is also a court drama about the infamous Scopes trial. Just compare these titles with another court drama, The Verdict, which is about a washed-up lawyer trying to get his life back on track by winning a civil suit. At first glance, one would say that the last of those titles is much more direct in what its plot is about than the other two, which is true to an extent. But the thing is, those titles are based off themes in their stories, rather than trying to give the audience an idea of what their story is about. And naturally, titles of that nature offer both advantages and disadvantages, as titles derived from thematic significance will often intrigue people, but also give them the wrong idea of what their story is about. This is often why titles might be nothing more than just the main character's name, because not only does it make for a rather easy title, but it lets the audience know right off the bat that the movie is essentially the story of that person, or that they'll at least have a major role in it. Even the likes of William Shakespeare often went this route, usually having his works be named after the main character. And even when he didn't, his titles were generally pretty straightforward, with such examples as The Taming of the Shrew, The Merchant from Venice, and The Temptress. In other words, when it came to Shakespeare, one generally knows what they're getting into just by reading the title alone. But this isn't to say that a non-indicative title can't be a good thing. Orson Welles, for example, famously loved the title of the 1973 movie Paper Moon, despite it barely having any relevance to the plot. And considering the movie's success, audiences seem to agree with him. Or for a more modern example of that, there's of course Reservoir Dogs. The story of both the planning and aftermath of a jewel heist gone horribly wrong. This movie contains absolutely no mention of reservoirs and barely has any dogs in it. Not even the smallest passing reference to the former, in fact. And yet, somehow it just feels like an appropriate title for a movie of this nature, even if one has difficulty explaining why. And not to mention, in this case, the poster helps make it very clear what kind of movie it actually is if one finds themselves confused by it. But that being said, perhaps the best example of that is a forgotten 1943 war drama called The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. Now, why is that title misleading, you might ask? Because for one thing, the main character isn't Colonel Blimp, it's General Candy. In fact, there isn't a Colonel Blimp even mentioned in the whole movie. And for another, and spoiler alert, he doesn't die. But in spite of that, it still proves itself to be a pretty great movie, and is often praised as one of the best examples of 1940s British cinema. Though the fact that the title is still intriguing, if irrelevant, definitely helps its case in this instance. But as I said before, since a title is the first impression an audience is going to have of a movie, it has to be a good one. Because the thing about all three of those aforementioned titles is that they're still good ones, even if they don't have much to do with their given stories. Basically, even if they don't wear their movie's plots on their sleeves, so to speak, they're still able to intrigue and interest the audience. But on the flip side, when a good movie has a bad title, that can single-handedly ruin any chance it has of finding an audience simply because most people will reject it based off that first impression alone. And a famous example of that would be the 1958 sci-fi horror movie, I Married a Monster from Outer Space. Now try not to tell me that just by hearing that title and seeing the poster that you're already picturing an awful, campy movie in the style of Ed Wood, or just one of those other generally horrible science fiction movies from the 1950s. Because even I'll admit that was exactly my first impression of it based off that ridiculous title. But as I was quick to learn, I was dead wrong about that. Because I'm not going to say it's the greatest science fiction film ever or anything like that, but this movie is much more intelligently written and pretty darn effective at being scary than you would ever suspect based off the title. As while the main character does indeed marry a monster from outer space, the movie isn't campy at all, and is instead very subtle in its scares, playing on people's paranoia and the concept of danger hiding in plain sight, as well as being extremely nuanced and even downright sympathetic in the way it treats the aliens. My point is, based off this movie's extremely campy and direct title, you'd never realize that it's actually good. Frankly, the writers should have been about as subtle with the title as they were with the horror, because in this instance the direct approach doesn't work and paints a very different picture of what it's actually about. And as a result, its reputation still suffers from a lot of discourse even to this day, just because it's a good movie with a bad title. And the same can also be said to a lesser extent with another 1950s sci-fi horror movie, It Came from Outer Space, which is similarly much more intelligently written than its campy and generic title would have you believe. So the point here is, when it comes to the title of a story, it's honestly much more important that the title be good and eye-catching than how relevant it actually is to the plot of the story. Though that being said, a title shouldn't be downright misleading either, because if it's too far off base from the story, it could end up making the audience believe it's completely different from what the plot actually is, which in and of itself isn't a good thing either. Because as I mentioned before, at least the strange titles mentioned earlier not only catch people's attention, but they still do in some way help indicate what the movie is about, if not always in the best of ways. My point is, nobody is going to accuse those titles of downright misleading them or making them believe they were going to be watching a completely different movie, except maybe Reservoir Dogs. But that being said, there's also what happens when a title is both non-indicative of what a movie is about and isn't very good to boot. And rather famously, there was no actor who suffered from this more than Jack Lemmon, because he was in at least 3 different movies over the course of his career that he felt were good, but that were dragged down by a bad title. And the most famous of these 3 was actually his debut, It Should Happen to You. Now, what is this movie about, you might ask? It's about a woman who wants to be famous, so she puts her name up on a billboard and suddenly finds fame falling at her doorstep because of that one simple action. Now, just like Jack Lemmon said, the title is completely irrelevant to the plot and is never even spoken in the film. And because it's not even a great one, especially for a comedy, many have passed it over based off that alone. Many movie critics have even talked at length about how inappropriate that title is and how it arguably hurt its reputation over the years. And the next movie of his with this problem would be Pfft. Yes, that's the title. Now, to be fair, at least this one has relevance to the movie in question and is actually mentioned, as the basic plot is a comedy centered around a husband and wife breaking up and then wanting to get back together. But that was seriously the best thing they could think of? How did they expect the audience to get behind a title that they couldn't even pronounce? And if they were trying to be funny and clever with that title, it didn't work out, as Piffed has actually gone down as having one of the worst titles for a movie ever. And finally, there was Lemmon's 1959 comedy with Doris Day titled It Happened to Jane. And just like It Should Happen to You, not only is the title not very good, but it also has absolutely no relevance to the movie. Because the plot is about a woman suing a railroad company for failing to get deliveries on time, and stopping the train outright once she realizes she has the power to do so. And Lemmon was quoted as saying that he felt the movie was good, but that the title destroyed any chance it had of being a success. And many a film expert, which granted I am not, have agreed with him on this. Because to put it simply, if you're going to give a movie like this a title like that, the it requires a lot more elaboration. Just because It Happened One Night worked as the title for a comedy doesn't automatically mean that It Happened makes for a good title for comedies, because it honestly doesn't. That would really be more at home in the thriller or horror genres than anywhere else. And even beyond that, Lemmon also had a few other movies with title problems. Some could even find the Best Picture winning The Apartment somewhat non-indicative in this regard. In fact, co-star Fred MacMurray even found his face on the receiving end of a woman's purse because she believed the movie was for children, as MacMurray was famously associated with Walt Disney by that point in his life, and it was most certainly not. Because the movie is actually about a man who loans out his apartment to his higher-ups as a safe haven for their extramarital affairs, only to find himself falling for his boss's newest lover. And as MacMurray himself freely admitted, the movie wasn't for children, but based off the title alone, it wouldn't indicate that, especially if you compare it with Psycho, released the same year, which just by the title alone makes it pretty clear that it's not a movie made for children. But despite all of that, The Apartment is still a rather great watch, if not one for kids. Heck, even Lemon's Academy Award-winning performance in Save the Tiger is once again pretty misleading, as simply put, it has nothing to do with a tiger, zoo, or even animals, instead being about a man going through a complete existential crisis as he grips with a life of failure. Again, even though it's pretty good, it's rather different from what the title implies. Okay, so hopefully all of these examples have helped draw a coherent picture of what does and doesn't make for a good title. It has to be eye-catching first and foremost, but also at least somewhat relevant to the movie's plot, as well as be appropriate for the genre it's a part of. Because as I went on at length about before, if a movie's title is off-putting or gives the wrong impression of what it's about, that alone could cause people to skip over it, as is what happened with quite a few of the movies mentioned earlier. Like I said before, a title is the first impression an audience gets of what a movie is going to be about, and just like in any other real-life situation, it's always very important to make a good first impression. In fact, beyond giving a story something to call it by, that might just be the single most valuable function behind a movie's title. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear from you guys. Do you believe that a good title for a story is a very important factor in determining that story's success? Or do you believe the title isn't really all that important so long as the plot is good? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And remember, you don't have to agree with any opinions discussed in this video. I was only talking about the general consensus surrounding how people feel about those movies and their titles. And if you disagree with that, you are most certainly free to. And thank you all for watching. It is all very much appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.